I didn't set out to follow the money, not at first. I was focused on the buildings, the maps, the peculiar consistency of design that seemed to span continents without a plausible explanation. But eventually, you reach a point where the physical evidence demands an economic question. You can't have cities of that scale, infrastructure of that precision, and a global aesthetic that appears virtually overnight without asking who paid for it. Not in abstract terms. Not in vague references to wealthy patrons or industrialists. I mean the actual capital, the gold, the liquidity required to move millions of tons of stone, to employ armies of laborers, to coordinate supply chains that stretched across oceans. When you examine the photographic record, the engineering achievements, the sudden appearance of entire urban centers in the mid-19th century, you begin to realize something that historians rarely address. The money had to come from somewhere. And if the official narrative can't account for the construction, it certainly can't account for the financing. So I started asking a different question. Not whether Tartaria existed, but rather what kind of financial system would have been necessary to build it. This is an investigation into the economic architecture that made the forgotten world possible. The problem with money is that it doesn't lie. Buildings can be repurposed, histories can be rewritten, photographs can be explained away or simply forgotten in archives. But ledgers, if they exist, tell a different story. The question is whether the ledgers exist at all. When you begin researching the financial landscape of the early to mid-1800s, you encounter a curious pattern. The institutions we're told financed the great projects of that era. The railroads, the canals, the urban development don't quite add up. The capital requirements were simply too vast. Consider for a moment what it takes to build a city from scratch. Not a town, not a settlement, but a planned metropolitan center with boulevards wide enough for processions, buildings tall enough to rival anything built today, and sanitation systems that presuppose an advanced understanding of hydraulics and public health. The money for such projects doesn't appear spontaneously. It accumulates over generations. It concentrates in the hands of banking houses, trading companies, sovereign treasuries. Yet when you trace the origins of the great 19th century construction boom, you find yourself chasing shadows. Take the example of San Francisco. The city as it appears in photographs from the 1870s is not a rough frontier outpost. It's a mature metropolis with opera houses, universities, streetcars, and architectural ornamentation that would have required skilled craftsmen working from pattern books that somehow existed simultaneously in New York, London, and Melbourne. The official story tells us this was the result of the gold rush, that sudden wealth created sudden cities. But gold mining, even at its most productive, doesn't generate the kind of organized capital required for urban planning. It generates chaos. Prospectors, saloons, tent cities, and lawlessness. What it doesn't generate is symmetrical boulevards and buildings with facades, so consistent they appear to have been designed by a single hand. The financial anomaly becomes even more pronounced when you examine the transportation networks. The railroads that supposedly united the American continent in the late 1800s were funded through a combination of government land grants and private investment. This much is taught in every history class. What isn't taught is the sheer impossibility of the timeline. The Central Pacific Railroad, for instance, began laying track in Sacramento in 1863. By 1869, it had crossed the Sierra Nevada, a feat of engineering that involved 15 tunnels through solid granite and connected with the Union Pacific at Promontory Summit. The speed of construction, the precision of the grading, the quality of the masonry, all of it suggests a level of organization and capital expenditure that borders on the miraculous. And yet the financial records from that period are fragmentary at best. We have headlines, we have political speeches, we have photographs of golden spikes. But the actual ledgers, the detailed accounts showing where every dollar came from and where it went, those are strangely difficult to locate. This is where the investigation takes an unexpected turn. If the money didn't come from the sources we're told, then it must have come from somewhere else. And if it came from somewhere else, then the financial institutions of the era must have been far more sophisticated, far more interconnected than we've been led to believe. I'm not suggesting a conspiracy in the conventional sense. I'm suggesting something simpler, and perhaps more disturbing, that we've been looking at the 19th century through the wrong lens entirely. That the economic activity visible in the historical record, the gold rushes, the railroad speculation, the banking panics, may have been surface phenomena, distracting us from a deeper current of finance that operated on different principles altogether. Consider the architecture of the banks themselves. The surviving photographs from the period show financial institutions that resemble temples more than offices. Massive stone columns, soaring ceilings, vaulted halls designed to inspire awe. These buildings weren't just storing money, they were making a statement about the nature of capital itself, that it was eternal, that it was sacred, that it flowed from sources beyond ordinary comprehension. The ornamentation on these buildings, the symbols carved into their facades, the proportions of their interiors, all of it suggests a worldview in which finance and cosmology were not entirely separate categories. And if that seems like an overinterpretation, consider the simple fact that these buildings were constructed to last millennia, not decades. They were built with the same durability, the same attention to mathematical precision as the cathedrals of medieval Europe. They were meant to outlive us. What I'm describing isn't a conspiracy theory. It's an observation about the physical evidence. The money existed, the buildings exist, the infrastructure, in many cases, still functions. The question is whether we're willing to ask where it all came from, or whether we'll continue accepting explanations that were written after the fact, by people who had every reason to simplify, to consolidate, to make the past look more primitive than it actually was. I invite you to consider, as we move forward, what it would mean if the financial system of the 19th century was not a primitive precursor to our own, but something more capable, more centralized, and ultimately more mysterious than anything that exists today. The buildings are waiting. The ledgers, if they exist, are waiting. And the money, whatever form it took, is still there, hidden in plain sight, embedded in the stone and steel of a world we've forgotten how to read. The difficulty in tracing the money is not that the records are missing, it's that the records that remain describe a financial reality that couldn't have supported what was actually built. This is the paradox at the heart of the investigation. We have bank statements, we have bond issuances, we have congressional appropriations. We have all the paperwork one could reasonably expect from a growing industrial economy. And yet, when you compare the documented capital against the constructed reality, the numbers simply don't work. It's not a matter of interpretation, it's arithmetic. Consider the Transcontinental Railroad again. The official cost of the Central Pacific's portion, from Sacramento to Promontory Summit, is recorded at approximately $36 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 million today. A substantial sum, to be sure, but not substantial enough. Civil engineering firms today, with modern equipment, modern explosives, and modern project management software, would struggle to replicate that route through the Sierra Nevada for less than several billion. And they would take years longer than the 4 years it actually took. The discrepancy isn't subtle, it's an order of magnitude, which means one of two things must be true. Either we've forgotten how to build things efficiently, or the recorded cost bears no relationship to the actual investment. The same pattern repeats across every major infrastructure project of the era: the Brooklyn Bridge, the Transcontinental Telegraph, the first transatlantic cable. Each one completed with a speed and precision that would be difficult to match today. Each one financed with amounts that seem impossibly small, given the scale of the work. The natural response is to assume that labor was cheaper, that materials were more abundant, that regulation was lighter. All of this is true to some extent, but cheap labor doesn't build granite tunnels through mountains. Cheap labor digs ditches. Cheap labor hauls water. What was required for these projects was not merely manpower, but expertise, organization, and machinery that itself had to be manufactured and transported. The capital requirements for such machinery alone would have consumed a significant portion of the budgets we're shown. This brings us to the question of what was actually being built, and for whom. The official narrative tells us these projects served public purposes: transportation, communication, commerce. But when you examine the designs, the materials, the level of finish, you begin to suspect another audience entirely: The stonework on 19th century infrastructure is often ornamental. The bridges, the tunnels, the railway stations, they're not merely functional, they're artistic, they're statements. They're built to be seen and admired by people who understood architecture the way we understand software, as a language, as a system of meaning. Who were those people? Who was expected to appreciate the carved capitals on a railway viaduct in rural Pennsylvania? Who was riding the trains that required stations with waiting rooms large enough to accommodate thousands? The photographs from the period offer a clue. Look closely at the crowds gathered for the opening of a new bridge or the completion of a railway line. The faces are not the faces of subsistence farmers or factory laborers. They're well-dressed, composed, confident. They stand before these massive structures, not as beneficiaries of public works, but as participants in something they understand. They belong to a world that had its own standards, its own expectations, its own economy. And that economy, whatever it was, operated alongside the one we read about in history books. Sometimes intersecting, sometimes competing, but never quite visible in the ledgers that survive. The question becomes whether this parallel economy was simply larger than the official one, or whether it operated on entirely different principles. If money is ultimately a measure of trust, a way of encoding value and transferring it across time and distance, then the financial architecture of the 19th century may have been more sophisticated than we imagine. Not despite its differences from our own system, but because of them. The banks that looked like temples were not metaphors. They were functional buildings designed for rituals we no longer remember. The vaults were not just for gold, they were for something else. Something that required stone walls, 12 feet thick, and doors that could only be opened by people who understood the combinations, literal and symbolic. I realize this sounds speculative. It is. But speculation is where investigation begins. The alternative is to accept that the physical world is filled with objects that make no economic sense, built by people who couldn't possibly have afforded them, for purposes that no one bothered to record. And that, it seems to me, is the less reasonable position. The evidence is not hidden. It's standing in plain sight in every city, along every railway, beneath every street. The question is whether we're willing to see it for what it is, evidence of a financial order that collapsed or was dismantled, leaving behind only the structures it built and the questions we're only now learning to ask. The investigation into financial architecture leads inevitably to paper, not the paper of ledgers and bonds, but the paper that passed between hands in daily transactions. Currency, banknotes, the physical representation of value that circulated through the forgotten world. And here, the evidence becomes both more accessible and more disturbing, because unlike corporate records, currency was printed in quantities that ensured survival. Collectors have preserved it. Museums have cataloged it. The images are available to anyone willing to look. What you find when you examine the banknotes of the mid to late 19th century is a visual language that bears almost no relationship to the financial instruments we use today. These were not utilitarian documents, with portraits of presidents and generic symbols of prosperity. They were elaborate engravings featuring architectural fantasies, allegorical figures, geometric patterns of staggering complexity, and sometimes imagery that seems to depict a world entirely different from the one described in history books. Buildings that never existed, machines that serve no identifiable purpose, landscapes organized according to principles we no longer recognize. The standard explanation is artistic license. Banknote engravers were craftsmen who borrowed from classical tradition, who exaggerated, who decorated. This is plausible until you notice the consistency. The same architectural forms appear on currency issued by different countries, different banks, different eras, the same symbolic arrangements, the same peculiar attention to structures that serve no obvious commercial or governmental function. If this were mere decoration, you would expect variation. What you find instead is repetition. A visual vocabulary shared across borders, suggesting either widespread cultural coordination or the documentation of something real. Consider the vignettes that appear so frequently on 19th century currency, immense domed halls with figures gathered in contemplation. Industrial landscapes where smoke rises from factories, arranged in geometric precision. harbor scenes filled with ships of a design that appears in no maritime archive. The temptation is to dismiss these as fantasies, as expressions of hope for what industry and commerce might achieve. But the people who printed money were not generally in the business of expressing hope. They were in the business of inspiring confidence. And confidence requires familiarity. The imagery on currency works because it depicts things people recognize, things that exist in their experience, things that anchor the abstract promise of value in concrete reality. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the buildings on the money were real? What if the industrial landscapes, the harbor scenes, the domed halls, were not aspirations but records? What if the currency of the 19th century depicted a world that was visible to the people who used it? A world that has since been removed from both the landscape and the historical memory. The question is not whether such structures could have existed. The question is, what would have happened to them if they did? The pattern becomes even stranger when you examine the material quality of the currency itself. These banknotes were printed on paper that no longer exists, using inks that have no modern equivalent, with engraving techniques that required skills we have largely lost. The level of detail is microscopic. The anti-counterfeiting measures are so sophisticated that modern reproduction methods struggle to capture them. This was not primitive printing. This was technology operating at a level that would not be seen again until the late 20th century. And it was applied to currency that circulated in a world we're told was struggling toward industrialization, a world of horse-drawn transport and handwritten letters. The implication is difficult to avoid. The financial system that produced this currency was not a primitive precursor to our own. It was a parallel development, equally sophisticated, differently organized, and ultimately replaced. The question is whether it was replaced voluntarily, through natural economic evolution, or whether something interrupted it. Something that required the suppression not just of the institutions, but of the visual record, the architectural evidence, the very memory of what the money represented. I mention this not to propose a specific theory, but to highlight the depth of the anomaly. Currency is the most intimate artifact of economic life. It passes through countless hands. It carries the imagery a society chooses to celebrate. If that imagery depicts a world we no longer recognize, then either the society was delusional or the world has changed more than we've been told. The paper survives. The buildings, in many cases, survive. The connection between them is what we've lost. And finding it requires following the money, not as economists understand it, but as archaeologists do, as evidence of a civilization that left behind more than ruins. It left behind its promises, engraved in microscopic detail, waiting for someone to take them seriously. The buildings themselves become the next piece of evidence. Not the public structures, not the civic monuments that still draw tourists and admiration, but the financial houses. The banks, the clearinghouses, the exchanges. These buildings were designed for purposes that extended beyond commerce, and their architecture preserves questions that no amount of renovation can entirely erase. Walk into any major city and locate the oldest banking hall still standing. What you'll find is consistent across continents, ceilings that rise 40 feet or more, floors laid in geometric patterns that serve no practical purpose, walls thick enough to withstand artillery, and light, always light, admitted through windows positioned not for external views, but for internal effect, casting illumination that changes with the hours in ways that seem almost liturgical. These were not offices, they were chambers, spaces designed for rituals that required particular conditions of acoustics, visibility, and atmosphere. The standard interpretation attributes this to Victorian grandeur, to an era when institutions expressed their solidity through architectural excess. But this explanation collapses under the weight of consistency. Why would banks in San Francisco, Melbourne, London, and Buenos Aires independently arrive at the same ceiling heights, the same floor plans, the same relationship between public space and private vault? The answer cannot be mere fashion. Fashion varies. What these buildings demonstrate is adherence to specifications, standards that crossed oceans and cultures, suggesting either a central authority or a shared understanding of requirements that we no longer comprehend. Consider the vaults themselves, not the small safes familiar from modern bank branches, but the strong rooms that occupy entire lower levels, accessible through doors that weigh tens of tons and require combinations known to multiple officers. The engineering of these vaults is extraordinary. The metals used, the alloys, the casting techniques, all reflect knowledge that metallurgists today would struggle to replicate without extensive research. And the contents they were designed to protect, whatever they were, must have justified not only the expense of construction, but the opportunity cost of occupying prime real estate with spaces that generated no obvious revenue. What was stored in these vaults? Gold certainly appears in the records, but gold is dense. A relatively small volume represents enormous value. The vaults are too large. They suggest the need to store something bulky, something that required square footage rather than merely weight. Securities, perhaps. Bond certificates, share ledgers. But these too are compact. The scale of the storage spaces implies either quantities that stagger the imagination or objects of dimensions that normal banking activity wouldn't generate. The photographs from interior inspections in the early 20th century show vaults lined with shelves, with cabinets, with compartments sized and shaped for specific contents. The shelves are empty in the photographs, or contain only scattered papers left behind during tingli. But the organization remains, adjustable shelving suggesting varied heights, drawer configurations implying standard document sizes that differ from modern paper dimensions, and in some cases, racks that appear designed for cylindrical objects, for rolls of something that required horizontal storage to prevent damage. This is where the investigation encounters physical evidence that resists easy explanation. In the basement of a former bank in Philadelphia, demolished in the 1960s, workers reportedly discovered a sealed chamber behind the main vault. Inside were shelves lined with canisters, each marked with coordinates and dates from the 1870s. The canisters, when opened, contained not documents, but rolled sheets of a metallic substance, inscribed with symbols that no one present could identify. The demolition crew, according to accounts from retired workers interviewed decades later, was instructed to dispose of everything without further examination. The canisters went into landfill. The chamber was filled with concrete. The symbols were never photographed, or if they were, the photographs have not survived. Stories like this circulate in the margins of historical preservation. They are difficult to verify and impossible to dismiss entirely. Too many such accounts exist, too many workers have come forward with similar memories, for all of them to be fabrications. The pattern suggests something real but fragmented, glimpses of a financial system that stored more than money and protected more than assets. A system that treated information as equivalent to gold, that encoded knowledge in forms we no longer recognize, that distributed its records across a network of vaults designed to survive anything short of direct destruction. The implications for understanding Tartaria, if that is the correct name for the civilization that built these structures, are profound. A society capable of constructing such facilities, of engineering such security, of maintaining such consistency across continents, was not primitive. It was not struggling toward industrialization. It was industrialized. It was standardized. It was connected by agreements and protocols that functioned without telegraphs or telephones because the people implementing them understood the requirements without needing to communicate them. They shared a world, and that world included financial architecture designed for purposes we are only beginning to guess at. The question becomes what happened to the contents. If the vaults were built to store something, and if that something was valuable enough to justify the construction, then its disappearance requires explanation. Either it was removed deliberately, systematically, by people who understood its significance, or it was destroyed. Or it remains where it was placed, behind walls we no longer think to open, beneath streets we no longer think to question, waiting for someone to remember the combinations. The disappearance of the contents points toward the larger disappearance, not just of assets, but of institutions, not just of banks, but of the financial architecture that connected them. The 19th century witnessed not only the construction of an extraordinary physical infrastructure, but also its systematic dismantling, reorganization, and renaming. Banks became other banks. Clearing houses became historical societies. Vaults became storage space for municipal records. or simply remained sealed, their combinations lost, their contents undisturbed because no one remembered they existed. The pattern is visible in the corporate histories, if you know where to look. Endless mergers, acquisitions, reorganizations that consolidated smaller institutions into larger ones, then consolidated those into still larger entities, until the original names disappeared entirely. The official narrative presents this as natural consolidation, the inevitable maturation of a chaotic banking sector into the orderly system we recognize today. But consolidation on this scale, executed with this precision, suggests coordination. Someone decided which institutions would survive and which would vanish. Someone determined which records would be preserved and which would be destroyed. The question is, who? The answer, insofar as one exists, lies in the emergence of the central banking system in the early 20th century. The Federal Reserve in the United States, established in 1913, the predecessor institutions in Europe that consolidated national currencies and national banking authorities. These were presented as responses to financial panics, as mechanisms for stabilizing economies that had proven unstable. But they also served another function. They centralized control over the money supply. They standardized currency. They made it possible to retire the old banknotes, the ones with the peculiar architecture and the unfamiliar symbolism, and replace them with something more uniform, more controllable, more easily explained. The timing is significant. The great wave of bank consolidations coincides with the period when the old photographs show cities changing, when the buildings we associate with the forgotten world began to be modified, remodeled, or demolished. The same forces that consolidated the banks also consolidated the physical landscape. The same logic that retired the old currency also retired the old architecture. Not through violence, not through explicit destruction, but through the slow, patient work of replacement. One building at a time, one merger at a time, one generation forgetting what the previous generation knew. This is not conspiracy in the conventional sense. It does not require secret meetings or shadowy cabals. It requires only that the people who inherited the system saw advantage in simplification, that they found the old ways inconvenient, the old records cumbersome, the old buildings expensive to maintain, that they made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, decisions that accumulated into a wall between us and the world that came before. The result is the same, whether intended or accidental. We live surrounded by the shells of a financial system we no longer understand, handling currency whose imagery has lost its meaning, walking past buildings whose proportions answer questions we have forgotten to ask. The investigation into the money that built the forgotten world does not end with answers. It ends with evidence, the ledgers where they survive, the vaults where they remain unopened, the banknotes preserved by collectors who recognize something important even if they couldn't name it. The evidence is waiting for interpretation. It has always been waiting. The question is whether we are ready to look at it without the filters provided by official history, without the assumptions that tell us the past was simpler than the present, without the comfortable belief that everything we need to know has already been discovered. The money exists, the buildings exist, the connections are there to be traced. What we do with them is no longer a question of evidence. It is a question of whether we are willing to see. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.